and welcome to this video on understanding turnout. Now, if you're a classical dancer, then obviously you're going to be working in turnout a lot of the time. But even in other dance styles that are more focused in parallel, if you're lifting your leg anywhere above about 45 degrees, you're having to use your turnout in order to get the leg height. Similarly, as you'll see through several of the videos I've done on different injuries, even when we're working in parallel, we're often having to recruit our turnout muscles just to align and stabilize ourselves in the parallel position. So this is really something that's relevant to all dancers, no matter what style of dance you're doing. And often it's the most misunderstood thing in dance. Certainly when I was a dancer, I really didn't understand the anatomy of turnout, and therefore I really wasn't getting the most out of my body. In this video, we're going to look at some of the theory of turnout, and then we'll work with some dancers to see how do we maximise the turnout when we're up and on our feet. The first question to ask, though, is why do we turn out? And that's quite an interesting thing, and it takes us back into the history of dance. Dance, in terms of classical ballet, is thought to have originated in the courts of Louis XIV in France. And when you look at the way they dressed in those days, the men particularly liked to show their legs off and often had quite frivolous shoes with bows on them. And turning the foot out was a way to present the foot and to show off the ankles. Similarly, there was a lot of fencing in this time. That was one of the sports of choice of the day, particularly in the courts. And when we see a lot of the fencing positions, they're very similar to the origins of classical ballet. And again, the feet were rotated outwards in a lot of these positions. Another reason why turnout became favoured was that it could improve choreography. The court dances were normally big group affairs with many dancers. And if you have your feet just in a parallel position, you can step forwards, you can step sideways, you can step backwards, but really the floor patterns would be quite limited to those sort of cross shape orientations. However, if you turn your foot out, you can actually start to go around a corner. And this is how more complex floor patterns began to emerge as people turned their feet and could then make more curving motions. So that's a little bit of the history. But why do we turn out from an anatomy perspective? Now, if you haven't already watched the video on Meet Your Hip Joints, I highly advise you go and watch that first so you get the underlying geography of what we're talking about here. But when we're looking at leg extensions, how we get our legs in the air, if you've ever tried to lift your leg to the side, for instance, when you're in a parallel position, you find that you very soon come up against a brick wall. And when we look at the anatomy here of the hip joint, you'll see that the top of the thigh bone there has a bump on the outside called your greater trochanter, and that, when it's in a parallel position, is sticking straight out to the side. So if you lift your leg up in a parallel position, that greater trochanter very soon comes up against the pelvic bone and it won't go any further. So that's why we can't lift our legs higher than about 45 degrees in parallel. However, as we turn out, we rotate that greater trochanter backwards so that it doesn't come into contact with the pelvic bone as we lift our leg. So if you've got a turned out leg in second, that greater trochanter has dropped backwards and facilitates the ability for the leg to go higher. Other things that can limit our flexibility, and this is something that really you're born with, and it's the question that dancers will often ask me or are brought to me to be assessed for this: how much of your turnout has room for improvement And at what point have you reached your maximum for turnout? Because everybody is different. When we look at the pelvic bone there that has the socket on it that receives the head of the thigh bone, this is what makes up our hip joint, you'll see that red cup there. That can be different shapes and sizes in different people. So if you've got a really deep hip socket, then that thigh bone gets bedded in quite deeply into that joint and it's very stable, but it's likely to be less flexible because there's more of a cup around that bone. If you've got a very shallow cup there, then you get more range of motion, but it's less stable. So there's always a payoff for these things. Increased flexibility leads to increased instability, and often this can lead to hip problems as well. So there's no good, bad, right or wrong. It's just what do you have and what can you do to keep it safe. Another issue, other than just the depth of that socket, is which way it points. I always talk about those two pelvic bones as being the Mickey Mouse ears, and if you think of the hip socket as being like the hole in your ear, some people's ears point more forwards, some people's ears point more towards the side. So the angle of that hip socket will also dictate your flexibility. If your hip socket points a little bit more forwards, then you might find it more difficult to get the leg back in second position, for instance. And you might often get told, push your leg back, and it feels like it's not comfortable for you. That could be why. If you're somebody whose hip sockets point more towards the side, you often have more flexibility, but again, often less stable. Another thing that we can have around the hip socket is something called a pincer arrangement. So some people have an extra bony growth on the lip of that hip socket that you can see on the right there. And again, you can imagine if there's a little bit more bone or the bone comes a little bit further down, if you try and lift that leg to the side, it's going to pinch up against that bone, and we call that a pincer impingement. Impinging means we're getting kind of caught and stuck on something. So that will often limit people's range, particularly with the leg going up to the side. Other things that we can have going on here on the thigh bone itself. So that thigh bone comes up and it kind of turns inwards by about 45 degrees, and then you have that round head of the femur at the top. Some people, that round head again has a thickened area of bone. It's got more of a bulbous shape to it, and we call that a cam impingement. So if you've got that extra roundness to the ball of the femur bone, then again that's going to come up against the hip socket when you try and move the leg up into more extreme extensions, and that can cause an impingement there. For some people, they've got both, and we call this a mixed impingement, where you've got both that pincer and a cam, and therefore you're going to be somebody that really struggles potentially with your flexibility, and it could get, again, if you push too hard, you can inflame these areas and start to have hip issues going on. Other things that go on are in the soft tissues. So around all our joints, go and watch the hip joint video to learn more about this, but the straps that link the two bones together at a joint are known as the ligaments. They're soft tissue, but they're not very stretchy and flexible because they're like leather straps that bind the two bones together. They'll allow for some range of movement, but they will limit extreme range of movement. Now, some people have more what we call laxity in those connective tissues, and these are our hypermobile people. Go and check the hypermobile videos for more on this. But those people have more give in the ligaments, and therefore that allows for more range of motion. So this is the capsule around the joint and the ligaments that surround the joint. We don't want to push through these. Again, watch the stretching video series for more on why we don't want to stretch our ligaments. They're there to protect the joint. So we would call this a non-modifiable limitation. The same with those bone issues we talked about. They're non-modifiable, i.e. you can't change them, or certainly in the case of ligaments, you shouldn't try to change them. What we can modify is the tension in the surrounding muscles. So things like your quadriceps, your hamstrings, your inner thigh muscles, these are all muscle groups that cross the hip joint and help us move the leg around in space. If you've got muscle tension here, they might be restricting your hip flexibility. And of course, these are things we can address with our good stretching practices and also making sure we're not doing things with our posture and our technique choices that are causing those muscles to shorten up too much and restrict the hip joint. So again, check out the stretching videos for more on how to address any muscle tension. Okay. What are our turnout muscles? I was told all the time as a dancer, use your turnout muscles, use your turnout muscles, and I wasn't really sure where they were. So here they are. We call them the deep 6 muscles because there are 6 of them and they're deep to the gluteus maximus muscle. So we all know the glute max, it's the big muscle on the back of the hip area. If you take that away, this is what you see underneath. So the big muscle at the top of this picture is called the gluteus medius, and you'll see me when we work with the dancers in a moment, you'll see me talking about that muscle and why we really don't want to be using that one for our turnout. But we do want to be focusing on these deep 6 muscles. You don't need to know all the fancy names, you just need to know how to recruit them, and we'll show you that in a moment. There's one called the piriformis, and this one a lot of people have heard about. It attaches to your sacrum, which is that triangular bone at the base of the spine. It actually attaches onto the front surface of that, the bit that points towards the front of your body, and it swings across that gluteus area underneath the glute max across to the leg bone. So it's attaching your sacrum to the leg. The other 5 of these, they attach to the pelvic bone. So the part of your pelvic bone that's heading down towards the sitting bone, they're all attaching along that bone and then coming across to the back side of your thigh bone, just behind that greater trochanter that we looked at. So you can imagine that if these muscles contract, they're going to pull that back of your thigh bone from that greater trochanter around towards the pelvic bone at the back. So they create that rotational motion. So those are the deep 6. Those are the ones we're going to be focusing on in the practical assessment. Okay, knees over toes. How often are we told to do this as dancers? Now you'll see me when I work with the dancers in a moment talking about how we need to modify that terminology a little because it's not terribly helpful to us. And there are some dancers for which this really isn't something that's actually achievable. If you've got neutral alignment of the leg bones, then yes, when you stand in a parallel position, your knees face forwards in alignment with the feet. But for some people, they have something called a tibial torsion. This is where the shin bone, called the tibia, has a little rotation to it. And this is just something you're born with. It's not something that you can change. It's not an injury. It's just a developmental thing that has happened in certain groups of people. And there are 2 different versions of this, and some people might have a little bit of one or a little bit of the other, and some might be quite extreme. If you have what's called an external tibial torsion, it means that even when your toes are out facing, like in a first position, your knees still face forwards, and that's simply because the bone itself has a little spiral twist to it, and therefore you're not going to be able to line your knees over your toes, and if you try to do it, you're probably going to create other issues for yourself. We also have another version of this called internal tibial torsion, which is going the other way. And these are the people that tend to have their toes pointing inwards. So again, here, the knees are not necessarily going to line up over the feet. So we need to be mindful, particularly if you are a dance teacher, that you're not asking a dancer to do something that isn't anatomically available to them. If you want to know more about this, there's a wonderful research paper. Go and check that out, and it'll give you more in-depth information about this issue of tibial torsion and what we can do to help those dancers modify their technique accordingly. Okay, so now we've looked at the anatomy here, let's move on to some practical exercises. Turnout. Everyone wants to know how to get more turnout, right? But we really want to be mindful about doing this safely, because hips, as we know as dancers, they get cranky. And trust me, I am making investments for you guys, for your future selves. I am here on behalf of your future selves, and not having hip issues in your 40s, 50s, 60s that you're like, I wish I paid more attention to taking care of my hips. Now go back and watch the video on Meet Your Hip Joints to really look at the hip joint anatomy. But when we're talking about turnout, there are lots of things that can limit turnout, and some of them are to do with the anatomy of the turnout. Watch the first video on this where I'll go into detail about things that limit turnout. We're all different, right? All three of us standing here will have completely different hip arrangements, different depths of our hip sockets, different shapes of the bone that goes around the head of your femur, your thigh bone. So you can't compare. You've got to work with what you've got. And cheating your turnout only cheats yourself, right? Knee problems, rolling, hip problems. There's a litany of things that come from doing this. So don't cheat yourself. Now, having said that, not all of us have flat turnout, right? That's a rare few that actually do have flat turnout. If you're a ballet dancer and you're going into a ballet company, you are required to stand at 180 degrees of turnout. That was my career. And I had to fake it, right? Because I don't have that at my hips. The difference between what you have anatomically and where you'd like to be is strength, but it's also your injury risk window. So you've got to decide whether you're going to take that gamble, right? So we can look at ways to really fire up our turnout control so that we are as protected as we can possibly be, but be honest with yourself about whether you're having to modify a significant amount, and be mindful of any pains and grumblings that come on in the body, and that you address those. If you have got any doubt about this, go and see a dance medicine professional who can do a proper assessment of you, check out exactly what you have available at your hip joint and what is just soft tissue restriction. If it's just muscle restriction around the joint, we can improve that. Go and watch the stretching series for that. But if you're at the maximum of your hip socket shape, and then any stretching you're doing is going into the ligaments, remember, we do not want to overstretch our ligaments. They are there to protect us. Okay, so having said all that, we're going to get into what is turnout. Now, I know dancers who are principal dancers with ballet companies who, when they actually learn what true turnout is, go, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know this when I was dancing as a ballet dancer either. So this is trying to give you the information that I wished I had at an earlier age. External rotation is where that's the fancy name for turnout, right? The anatomical name is where we're rotating the thigh bone outwards, and it's along the line of the bone, and this is really important distinction to make. So I'm just going to pop my little spare spine down there. Let's find this first of all. Actually, before we do that, let's do a little, this is what I always do with dancers to get them into their honest selves, right? So standing in parallel to start with, in one movement, with no cheating, you're just going to turn your feet out to your first position, just in one movement. Boom. Okay. Now, some people, when they do that, these guys were pretty honest, I have to say. Some people, when they do that, will do a with the back of the body, and then they'll waggle and, you know, wedge those feet around. That's not your true turnout. In one motion, where do you get to? If we want to really see what your true turnout is, and this can often be a little confronting for people, you can do this along with us if you're watching this video. If you lie onto your back for us and just have your feet straight out to the front and lie all the way down and flex your feet as if you're standing in parallel, and now turn your feet out into a first position. Pop your head up and have a look. Welcome to your turnout. Is that where you stand? No. Okay. So that's okay, but it means, remember, that the difference between what you see there and what you do when you're standing and you've got a floor to wedge your feet against is increasing that risk of injury. So we need to be mindful that we're controlling that turnout if we are going beyond our natural range. Okay, bring yourselves back up to standing. Let's find out what external rotation truly is, because this is the trap that a lot of people fall into. So what we're going to do is we're going to have one foot on the ball of the foot, and if we have maybe one of you facing sideways, and then we've got a couple of views for our audience out there. Now we're going to find a couple of bony landmarks. Let me bring my model in. On the outside, this is a thigh bone that's been chopped off, in case you were wondering. There's a bump on the outside of your femur there. It's called your greater trochanter. There's no quiz, you don't have to remember this, but if you're an anatomy geek, you might like to know. If you're not sure where that is, if you kind of slump into your hip and run the palm of your hand over there, you can find that round bump. If you do like side-lying work with kicks, often it's the one that digs into the floor, right? So that's that greater trochanter. So we're going to put a thumb onto that, and then we're going to put our middle finger around onto the sitting bone, which is right at the bottom of the pelvis. If you're not sure where that is, just bend your knee up and prod your finger up into the glute area, and it should be pointing straight down there for you. Again, it's the one, if you're doing floor work, often you're kind of rolling on those sitting bones. So what we're doing there, we've got a thumb on our greater trochanter, and our middle finger wrapped around to the sitting bone. Now, turning out, if we bring that foot onto the ball of the foot, you're just going to rotate, so bringing the heel forwards and back. Now, can you feel that rotation happening up at the hip there? Is your thumb, as you turn out, you should find your thumb is moving towards that sitting bone, so you're actually closing that gap up. Okay, that is turnout, external rotation of the hip. Okay, and it's actually not a huge movement, right? It's quite a minimal movement. You're not going to go very far there because the bones will come up against the bones, okay? What most dancers are doing is a very different movement to that. And for that, if we come to the bar, and we're just going to do a parallel retire, and we're going to do the same thing, fingers on the same spot. Now, how many people get yelled at in a dance class to push your knees back, right, in plie or in passe position? That cue is not very helpful, because pushing your knees back, if we do that now from that position, thumb there, finger there, open like you're opening a window, push that knee back and come back. Can you feel your finger and thumb getting closer to each other in that position? No, they're staying the same distance apart. This is not external rotation. The technical term for this motion is lateral abduction. Lateral means sideways. Abduction means moving away from the middle of the body. It's lateral abduction, not external rotation. Two different movements. The issue with this is that the muscle that is the primary mover of that lateral abduction is our good old friend that's popped up in many of these videos already, the gluteus medius muscle, which is the little muscle on the outside of the hip, little teardrop-shaped muscle under your glute max, but on that side of the hip. So if you prod your fingers into that and do that knee to the side, can you feel that muscle firing up in there. Yeah, you look like you're in the right spot. So it's great for lateral abduction, our gluteus medius, but guess what else it does? Internal rotation. Didn't we want to get external rotation? Internal rotation is the opposite of that, which is wonderful if you want to be a Fosse dancer. But if we're in ballet class and we're looking for turnout, if you've set up your développé, and I call these the dead-end développés, I get people coming to me saying, I can kick my leg up here, but I can only hold it up to here, and I feel like I've hit a brick wall and I can't get any further. It's a dead-end développé. If you've set up your développé by having your knee pushed back, you've pushed that knee back in second, and you've fired up that gluteus medius muscle, the moment you go to extend that leg, what's it going to want to do? Turn you in, yeah, because it's an internal rotator. Then your teacher's going, turn out, turn your leg out, turn your leg. You're like, oh, I got to battle again. And suddenly you've got a war zone going on in your hip because you're trying to do something with a muscle that's doing something else, and it's not going to work, okay? So let's not do that. Be mindful that rotation motion, when you're coming into that passe position, you want to be feeling that leg wrapping around. So you're wrapping, wrapping, wrapping. I like the idea of spirals. You'll probably hear me talk a lot about spirals, candy cane spirals. If you imagine that spiral starting from that greater trochanter, going round to the sitting bone, and then doing a candy cane all the way down your leg, so that as you rotate here, let me borrow your leg here, if you would take that out into just a little low développé, yeah, you want to go under, 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 under. Make sure you're doing the same with the other leg. Yeah, beautiful. And see how beautifully presented that leg is. If we were starting, if you go back to retire and then set it up with that knee back thing, and now do your développé, I can feel it all crunching up in here, and that foot is nowhere near as rotated around as it was before. Feel the difference? Yeah, it's subtle, but it's there. Okay, so if you are over-dominating with those glute mediuses, go and watch the stretches on how to release your glute medius. It can get really crampy as well sometimes, particularly when I'm asking you to do awkward things like that. What we want to do is fire up our turnout muscles. If you don't know what or where your turnout muscles are, which I have to say most dancers don't. I didn't when I was a dancer. People used to say, use your turnout muscles. And I was like, not quite sure what that is, so I'll just kind of grip everything in this general area because they're around there and hope for the best. And then most people are just kind of over-gripping their glutes. The turnout muscles, go and watch the Meet Your Hips video, and you'll see the anatomy of the deep six, as they're called. I won't go through their very long anatomical names now and bore you with that, but go and look at them. They're like a little fan of muscles, and guess where they run? Between that greater trochanter we found and the sitting bone. Apart from one of them, 5 of them do, and one of them goes to your sacrum in your lower back. But they run right between those 2 spots, and of course when they contract, they're pulling that bone around. That's their job, okay? It's their mission in life. How do we get those fired up? For me, this is dance. Get these working, life becomes a lot easier. Not only are they there for turnout control, and this, you don't have to be in ballet class for this to work, but the majority, I think it's about 98% of the population, have a tendency towards that pronation of the feet. That's called rolling in our language. And they're actually, even in a parallel position, slightly turned in. I get most dancers activating their turnout even in a parallel position. So even if you don't work in ballet turnout, you still need these muscles active in parallel. And guess what? If your leg's going anywhere above 45 degrees to the side in any form of dance, you need to be turned out because the anatomy, again, excuse me, doesn't work. That knobble on the outside that we just found, if you go up in a parallel position, it's going to come up against the bone. One of the reasons we turn out is to drop that bump behind so that we can get the leg up, right? We are working with our anatomy, not against it. So even if you're in a parallel but you're kicking to the side, if you're going above about 45 degrees, you have to be turned out, otherwise it ain't going anywhere. Okay, so here's the bit that we really need to know, how to get those muscles fired up. And they're small muscles, relatively speaking, which means they're actually quite quick to get fired up. And if you just do a few of these as an exercise every day, you'll find it really, really transforms what you're doing, and they're highly protective for all our knee injuries, foot injuries as well. They're also the muscles that help to catch us when we land from a jump. If you're landing from jumps and activating those turnout muscles, it's taking a lot of the body weight and not allowing it to collapse down into the legs. So things like stress fractures, shin splints, these can be great for offsetting those issues as well. Okay, so let's get to the fun part of how we work them. So for this, we're going to be lying on our fronts. And we're giving you a couple of different views here. We're going to turn the feet out as if you're standing in first position, okay? So feet flexed. And then we're going to do a battement tendu behind you. So really, really low off the floor. So you're not lifting too high. If you lift higher, you have to activate the glute muscle. So come back down. Just relax the glutes if you can and see if you can just, yeah, there you go. One of the things that people do wrong with this is they have the leg out to the side. Guess what? If it's going out to the side, you're firing up that glute medius again. Make sure it's absolutely behind you. And then the other thing is sometimes just relax the legs down for a moment. Didn't want you to hold them too long. The other thing is often people don't have the knee completely straight. So make sure you're focusing on straightening the knee and making sure that foot is going directly behind you and not out to the side, which I call secabesque, halfway between second and arabesque. Okay, so what we're going to do, you're going to tendu that leg up, then you're going to flex the foot when it's in the air and squeeze a little more turnout. See how we brought ourselves a little more there? And you can really see those muscles firing up. Then point again, and then another flex, and as you do the flex, you're going to squeeze a little more out and keep the back of the knee straight. Good, and relax down. Do you want to try it with the other leg? Okay, so tenduing to the back, flex the foot, and squeeze a little more out. Good, yeah. Let's get the back of that knee. Yeah, oh, you feel that extra? Yep. All that you didn't know you had. Okay, so that's a good way to find it. You can also actually put your fingers into that area just under the glute muscle so you can feel them working. It helps to kind of bring it to life for you so they don't feel like just a sort of wishy-washy area. You're like, oh, those are the guys working. Now, the little routine I give to people as a daily exercise to do, we take it into a kind of a ballet class rhythm, and you're just going to do point and flex, point and flex, point and flex, and a point and close are the leg and flex. So you can do a little sequence of 8 point and flexes with each leg. Do 2 or 3 rounds of that. Then, good idea to do it before class, and then it's like, oh, they're all fired up and ready to work. So let's bring you back into a standing position. And if we come back into our parallel, and let's go right back to what we did at the beginning, where we did our turn into first position. But this time, we're going to do it using our new friends that we just found. So think of that candy cane spiral. You spiral your legs so much, and you've got those lovely muscles fired up, yeah, at the back here that you've just been playing with. And then you just squeeze them so much that they just pull your feet into a first position. Yeah, that felt a little less cranked, a little easier. Does that feel better to you? Yeah. Okay. And then from that position, let's just do a rise. And again, a lot of people, when they're doing a rise, they're often like the feet are like powerlifting this big stack of plates above them. It's sort of, all a bit precarious. So what we want to do is, again, think of that rotation. We've got these guys nicely fired up, and you just rotate so much that they just lift you into the air. Like they've literally taken you, beautiful, stable rises. Yeah. Feel quite, just went off at the end there, but before that, yeah. You could have a cup of tea there, check your emails, yep. Nice and stable, because these muscles are taking care of that stack of plates above, so your legs don't have to power lift everything. So for me, this is everything. It's jump, takeoff, and landing. Point work if you're a ballet dancer, all about this. I'm more interested in how strong these muscles are than your feet, because if these aren't working, your feet are having to do twice as much work. and they're stronger muscles. So again, whenever we do isolated exercises like that, really useful to get those muscles fired up and kind of into your little repertoire of muscle use, but then you must put it into context in class. Actively take that in, be mindful, okay, am I really working? How can, even if you just pick one exercise of class that day and all I'm going to focus on is how I'm integrating that strength into practice. Remember that the muscles and the brain's orchestration of the muscles is very context specific. So if you simply do isolated exercises, the brain goes, oh, when we lie on the floor, that's when we do that thing with those turnout muscles. But up here, it's like, oh, no, they're not involved, right? You have to actively engage and put them into process, and then they'll become part of that little software program for those movements. So be really mindful. Find your true turnout. Make sure you're in external rotation, not opening and shutting windows. And when you're doing any kind of extension, make sure we haven't engaged that internal rotation. We're supporting underneath with those external rotators, and that candy cane spiral goes on into infinity with every extension that you're doing. Okay, understand a little bit more about turnout now?
Yes.
Yeah, excited to go and put it into action?
Yes.
Okay, take care, see you in the next video.